9 U.S. Presidents Assassinated by Globalists by Larry Engel. This is article number 8 about the assassination of the 11th President of the United States, James Knott Polk, who served from 1845 to 1849, only 4 years. The assassination was accomplished by arsenic poisoning, and it was done by expert Illuminati doctors who were either true believers in the Luciferian doctrine and the banking cartel, or else their families may have been threatened and they feared for the life of their children and their family members. This series of articles, 9 U.S. Presidents Assassinated by the Globalists, is under attack, and they're trying to censor it so that you, the listener, cannot hear these news and educational broadcasts. The claim is that I have infringed somebody's copyright. Well, it involves music that was improvised and recorded in 1935, 1934, maybe even 1933. There have been as many as 18 claims of copyright infringement, and all but 2 have been dismissed, because anything that's in public domain should be available to the people of the United States. And there's something very serious going on that is called sedition. The idea in sedition is to attack the people of a nation and to destroy their morale. And by removing all of their music, taking over copyright and saying the music that should belong to the American people in public domain is no longer available to them. That's a way of lowering the morale of the American people. These people falsely claim that they have a copyright on it, and they've removed it from public domain. So what that means is that that is an attack not only on this video series, but really it's sedition. And sedition is an attack on the morale of the people. The music belongs to the people of the nation after a certain number of years. And so they have tried to remove that, and then they would substitute some other form of satanic music or rap music or something that's bad in its place. And also it's the idea of an attack on the people to lower their resistance to the takeover of their social institutions and their government. There's a great deal of really super good music that's been available to the American people since the 1930s, and most of it has gone into public domain. The people that created and original publishers have already been compensated for it. And after that, then it belongs to the public, because the public is part of the copyright law. In reporting to you the sedition and the crime against the nation, in a news broadcast and in an educational broadcast, I am not violating copyright law. This is protected by copyright law. I am permitted by copyright law to use copyrighted material if it's in a news broadcast or if it's in an educational broadcast and it's used for those purposes. There's a lot of court cases that support this. And these people have never shown that they have this real copyright. How did they acquire a copyright on something that should be in public domain? They have never made any demonstration. They just claim they hold the copyright. And I claim they don't. So we have a standoff there. When they show me that they actually have a copyright and have legally acquired one, then I may not use their material, or the material that's in question. It's certainly not their material, because it belongs to the American people. It's in public domain. Now, the reason why they take things out of public domain is the crime of sedition. One of the ways of destroying a nation and taking it over is to take over the culture. And so sedition is an attack on the morale of the people. And one way you take over the morale of the people is take all their music away from them. And that's what they've done. They've claimed copyright on things that belong to the American people. And by doing this, they reduce the ability of the people to resist the takeover of their social and political institutions. That's the purpose of sedition. That's the purpose of taking over and denying us access to hundreds and hundreds of pieces of music that should be available to every American for free. And we should be able to enjoy this. But they want to censor it from us so they can replace it with something that appears to me to be Luciferian and satanic, and even to involve human sacrifice rituals. James Polk was a great man and a very strong president. He was a Jacksonian Democrat. Jackson was called Old Hickory, and Polk was called New Hickory. These were real men, very hard and very assertive. President Polk took so much real estate from the European royalty and gave it to our nation that is almost beyond imagination. President Polk confused the globalists because he owned slaves and he supported a low tariff, both Southern political platforms. As the globalists worked to create the Civil War, they drastically underestimated this president, and before they could wake up, he had annihilated most of their enormous land holdings and locked the door to their bank. President Andrew Jackson called the bankers a den of vipers and a den of thieves. And President James Not Polk was the snake exterminator. And to add a note of humor, and I know that this is true, that President Jackson's pet parrot was removed from his funeral for cussing. Polk accomplished all his goals in one term of office, and unlike other presidents, was murdered near the end of his term to ensure that this young president could not be drafted for a second term or hold any important office where he would again devastate the globalist agenda. Polk seemed to thrive as president and vigorously pursued his goals. His career was an upward swing from the beginning. His health never in the way. So the given cause of death, that he was exhausted by being president and the presidency exhausted him, is nothing but bovine excrement. He was 49 years old when he took office and only 53 when he was murdered. A very young man, he died 12 years earlier than the average life expectancy at the time. He was poisoned by skull and bone spooks from New Orleans. He lived only 103 days after he retired from the presidency. In April, soon after returning home, he recovered, likely because whoever it was that was poisoning him had lost touch when he moved away from Washington. But in June, they again were able to reach him, and they then finished him off. He died in June, on June 15th. My source, James K. Polk, A Biographical Companion by Mark E. Binus, only names one of several doctors who attended him at home and in Washington. This was Dr. Felix Robertson, who Polk trusted and called himself. Arsenic can be administered in several different ways and in different doses, producing a variety of symptoms, especially when given by a medical expert who is determined to cover his tracks. I doubt that Robertson was the assassin. The official claim that he died of cholera contradicts his doctors, who assured him that he did not have cholera. Polk himself also stated that he was alert to cholera and was taking precautions. Near the end of his term, he had made a goodwill tour to New Orleans. It was here that the poisoning of the president began. New Orleans did have some bouts of cholera. Cholera is a bacterial disease spread through contaminated water. However, I found no reports of others who accompanied the president being affected. So a claim that cholera was the cause of the president's death is not substantiated, and it is a very weak claim. Like one author said, the official story should be relegated to the graveyard of frauds, of hoaxes, and of fairy tales. And in this series, if I may repeat, most of the time the official story, if you look at it carefully, can be relegated to the graveyard of hoaxes, frauds, and fairy tales. 9 presidents were assassinated. 5 by poisoning, 4 by shooting that we know about. 4 others were attempted but survived but were severely compromised. And then there was one whose child was murdered and he was compromised by that. And on top of that, we have a number of other people who were candidates for the president but were murdered before they were elected. Before the Civil War, on a per capita basis, New Orleans was the wealthiest city in America. Drawn by the rich cotton and sugar plantations, abundant trade, and a thriving port, Americans came seeking their fortune. From the city's earliest days, New Orleans had close ties to the money centers of New York, of Boston, of Philadelphia, and of London and of Paris. The House of Rothschild's English bankers began living full-time in New Orleans in the early 1800s. In 1857, Judah Benjamin was the agent in New Orleans for the House of Rothschild. His job was to fund the Confederacy, help foster a devastating civil war, and to divide America, making it easier to conquer. Judah Benjamin was the Confederacy's dictator. Jefferson Davis and General Robert E. Lee, who are famous, and many others, were more like just Benjamin Judah's puppets. Judah Benjamin was the great puppet master of the South, and he controlled by his strings all the Confederate leaders. How did he do this? Because he had all the Confederate treasury, all the money, in his own personal account in London. No one could even buy a toothpick unless he approved it. The Confederacy was not just composed of the southern states of the United States. It included the whole thing called the Golden Circle. The Golden Circle included the South, the southern states, but it also included the Caribbean, parts of South America, parts of Central America, and of course Mexico, where Maximilian, the brother of the Austrian emperor, would become the emperor of Mexico, and then after they got rid of Abraham Lincoln and took over the United States and occupied us with British and Austrian and French troops, well, then Maximilian would become the emperor of the Golden Circle. So that's what the Golden Circle comprised, was the Caribbean, South America, Central America, Mexico, and the southern states. And he would be emperor over the Confederacy, and when the Confederacy defeated Abraham Lincoln and the Union, the Austrian troops and the French troops and the British troops would occupy America. And Maximilian would be the Emperor of America. That didn't happen. Judah Benjamin and John Slidell were members of the Mystic Crew of Comus, a New Orleans Mardi Gras society that concealed Skull and Bones members, secret agents, and other activities. A deathbed confession revealed that they assassinated Presidents Abraham Lincoln, William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor, and they attempted to poison, and they did compromise, President James Buchanan, who served just before Lincoln. I think the reason this deathbed confession did not also include the assassination of President Polk is because his murder was ordered as an international conspiracy rather than a Civil War operation. Polk and his policies were a large favorite in the South, but he did enormous damage to European interests in the Western Hemisphere. Therefore, Judah Benjamin and John Slidell, European banking cartel spies, acted outside of New Orleans' inner circle. Polk's visit to the New Orleans nest of killers was the beginning of the end for him, however. The fact that a branch of the Skull and Bone Society was established at the Tulane University in New Orleans was not a coincidence, and this occurred in 1907, but they had been operating long before that and involved a medical school. Two things were very much on President Polk's mind. One was the Monroe Doctrine. President James Monroe had said that European interference and colonization in the Western Hemisphere and in North America was no longer permitted. And number two, President Polk was very interested in Western expansion, which came to be called Manifest Destiny. That meant that when he was finished his presidency, that America would go from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast. So he greatly enlarged our nation. Manifest Destiny is what that was called. Slidell's efforts to obstruct Polk's plans failed, but it is very interesting to look at how this was handled, and is further evidence that supports the motive behind Polk's murder. Following the annexation of Texas, President Polk brought his attention to California. He wanted to acquire California before any European nation occupied it, and the main interest at that time was San Francisco, which could then open a great deal of trade in Asia. In 1845, he sent the then unsuspected undercover spy, European intelligence agent John Slidell, to Mexico as a minister to purchase California and New Mexico for $24 to $30 million. Of course, Slidell was working for European interests, not for Polk or American interests. Both obstruct Polk, and to conceal Slidell's true motives, the Mexicans refused to receive him, citing a technical problem with his credentials. Slidell returned to Washington in May 1846, having been rebuffed by the Mexican government. Polk regarded this treatment of an American diplomat as an insult and ample cause for war. It appears that the Mexicans may have been tricked into attacking, wounding, and killing U.S. soldiers. And Polk got Congress to declare war on Mexico. The result was that later, when Austrian military officer Maximilian became Emperor of Mexico its territorial size was a mere fraction of the Illuminati's original plans. Mexico became so weak because of Polk's war that Central America declared independence from Mexico and formed its own nations. The Europeans, with big aspirations in Mexico and in Oregon, even with their agent Slidell in place, totally underestimated President New Hickory Polk and his ability to kill their agenda. And there is more. Oregon Territory, since 1818, was jointly occupied by America and the British. And President Polk offered the British a border, the current border actually, between the United States and Canada. But they refused. So President Polk said, okay, I'll just take it all. So he was prepared to send United States troops up there into the Oregon Territory. And if he had done so, he would have taken over all of British Columbia, which is a great large part of Canada today. And the British said, oh, we give up, we refuse, we'll accept the current border of the United States. So that's how we got our present border between Canada and the United States. And the Oregon Territory became part of the United States, not jointly occupied. British ships immediately cut and ran out of California ports. So to summarize, in a single term of office, just 4 years, President Polk took the following territory away from the European royal dynasty domination. What did he take? The states that are now Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, California, New Mexico, Arizona, and you might include Texas, which sort of frees itself, and all the nations in Central America, Belize, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama. They all dropped away from Mexico. When any president took any territory that the Europeans were interested in, that they were colonizing in, the result would always be that they, globalists, that is, the globalists, would assassinate the President of the United States. So in this video, I have offered you motive and opportunity on the assassination of this president. Now, do you think that these European globalists had any reason to assassinate President Polk, to poison him? And yet, there is even more motive. To add to this great mystery, in 1846, Polk approved a law restoring the independent treasury system, under which the government funds were held in the treasury and not in banks or other financial institutions. This established independent treasury deposit offices separate from the private or state banks to receive all America's government funds. This system operated totally in gold and silver coins. There was no central bank of issue and no debt-based paper money. This threatened and undercut Rothschild's financial power. And this system remained in place until 1913, when the current Federal Reserve swindle took over the monetary system of the United States of America. And in order to achieve that, what happened? Well, President Garfield was murdered, President McKinley was murdered, Teddy Roosevelt was shot, Harding was poisoned, and Calvin Coolidge, who became the next president, his son was murdered. That's how we got the Federal Reserve. I have written an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that would make it constitutional to return to the monetary system that was in place from 1848 to 1913. the monetary system of President Jackson, the monetary system of President Polk, and the monetary system of President Lincoln. Because that system represents the interests of equality and freedom, and not the elite globalist European royalty. The difference is that the volume of money is controlled by the state legislatures, the 50 state legislatures who appoint delegates to a committee. And this would then distribute the power and would make the monetary system much more under control and loyal to the people and the interests of the nation. You can see it by going to www.lincolnamendment.net. Please offer your comment. I would like to hear what you have to say. The Independent Treasury System Foundation, built by both Polk and Jackson, allowed Abraham Lincoln to win the Civil War. Congress approved Lincoln's request for $450 billion in debt-free Treasury notes, paper money, called greenbacks, which paid for the Union Army and the Union Navy. This act defeated the European plan to split America and at the same time to put the nation into deep debt. So in our mystery today, I have offered you motive and opportunity. Was John Slidell a British spy? There was his handling of the Mexican-American War affair. His daughters became, one a countess in Europe, and the other a baroness, and his son-in-law, the Baron Frederick Emil de Erlanger. John Slidell resigned from the U.S. Senate upon the secession of the states of the South of the Confederacy. Slidell soon accepted a diplomatic appointment to represent the Confederacy in France. He negotiated a loan of $15 million from French capitalists, primarily Rothschild, and secured the ship Stonewall for the Confederate government. Slidell moved to Paris, France, after the Civil War. He died in Cowes, Island of Wight, England, at age 78. The New Orleans Mardi Gras deathbed confession includes him in a Skull and Bones conspiracy to assassinate 4 U.S. presidents. Was Judah Benjamin a British spy? He was the Rothschild agent in New Orleans. In her autobiography, Confederate President Jefferson Davis' wife, Verena, informs us that Judah Benjamin spent 12 hours each day at her husband's side, tirelessly shaping every important Confederate strategy and tactic. Davis and Robert E. Lee were just puppets, probably afraid that Skull and Bones would either cut them out or assassinate them also, if they were not willing to give blind obedience to Benjamin and to the Rothschild dynasty. And what about Rothschild, who financed the Civil War? How was he punished? When did he stand trial? He financed the murder of 500,000 American soldiers. So how did he stand trial? How was he punished for that? He put his money behind creating a war that would kill thousands of Americans, so how was he punished? Well, he sat in his mansion and enjoyed his money and was never indicted or never put on trial. Maybe not even accused, except by me. He was never indicted. He was never brought to trial. But he made, without his money, without his motive to hire and pay for people to make a war and try to divide up the United States, there wouldn't have been all this death. He's really not what he calls himself. He is really a satanic person, a Lucifer worshiper. Judah P. Benjamin was the founder of the Illinois Central Railroad, a state legislator, a planter who owned 140 slaves, who historians have labeled correctly the brains of the Confederacy. Of course, I call him the dictator of the Confederacy. He was also a skull and bones officer and also participated in the assassination of presidents. Benjamin served as the Confederacy's Attorney General, as their Secretary of War at one time, and later as Secretary of State. He was born a British subject in the West Indies and died a British subject living in France, where during his time in America he had situated his wife and children. He sent commercial agents to the Caribbean to negotiate opening ports in Bermuda, in the West Indies, and in Cuba to Confederate blockade runners in order to maintain war supplies which the Union was trying to prevent. This was just part of the larger Confederacy that was to be ruled by the European Emperor of Mexico, Maximilian. Benjamin controlled Confederacy funds by transferring them to his personal bank accounts in Europe. Benjamin arranged his son-in-law Erlanger's loan from a Paris bank to the Confederacy in 1863. Baron Frederick Emile de Erlanger was fellow assassin Slidell's son-in-law. Benjamin's brother, Joseph Benjamin of Colin J. McRae, was the Confederate financial agent in Europe. However, Britain's people had repudiated and outlawed slavery as an abomination. They would not tolerate slavery and demanded the condition that the South must free the slaves before the British government could send troops. The Confederate leadership failed to meet this condition, could not muster the power to do it. Abraham Lincoln could and did end slavery forever with his Emancipation Proclamation. And when he did so, the British military and financial support of the South crumbled, ending the Civil War. So our question was, Judah Benjamin a spy? Judah Benjamin was the only high-ranking Confederate politician to flee the country to avoid treason charges. His arrest and trial would have been very interesting because by that time many sources had reported and exposed his part in the assassination of Lincoln. As he fled, the ship he was on was met by a British warship that he boarded. Did the Queen of England return this hideous, traitorous criminal, Judah Benjamin? No, she didn't. In fact, Judah Benjamin became a distinguished barrister in England. And in 1872, he was appointed to the Queen's own council and made $700,000. I offer my observation, my intuition, and my opinion to present the case that when a president attempts to represent the people of the United States and the interest of our nation, that they are assassinated by the globalists. President Polk was a great man, and he was a great president, and he added huge sums of territory to our American country, and he was rewarded with being assassinated at a very young age.